Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Namo Shubhaya Krishna Vishtaya Vishnu Bhakti Vikasa Swami Vivekananda Namo Shubhaya Krishna Vishtaya Vishnu Bhakti Vedanta Swami Vivekananda Namaste Saraswati Devamani Pracharya Nirvishesha Shundavadi Vashtadi Vishakarani Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare So, Hare Krishna, welcome back to our discussion, our study of Sri Vedanta Syamantaka. So, this is session 20. We are discussing the third chapter of this work. So, till now, whatever we have seen in the last 3 sessions of this third chapter with respect to Jiva, I'll just do a quick recap because in comparison to the second chapter, this is a bit technical. More complex topics are involved, more intelligence has to be employed to understand certain topics. So, I'll just give a brief recap of what we have discussed till now. So, first was we discussed about the definition of the living entity, similar to how we did for Ishvara, that the living entity is atomic consciousness. So, the Ishvara is also conscious, the living entity is also conscious, but the consciousness of the living entity is atomic. And to justify or to substantiate this understanding, this Nitya Nityanam Chetanas Chetananam text was employed. So, just like for Ishvara, we have this Tam Ishwaranam Paramam Maheshwaram, Tam Devatanam Paramam Cha Devatam. That verse was there, which was the defining factor, based on which other arguments kind of revolved around that. So, that was the substantial or the basic understanding from which everything was derived. So, similarly for Jiva also, this Nitya Nityanam Chetanas Chetananam is the first verse which was quoted by Radha Damodar Goswami, which basically defines the entire gamut of discussion of the living entities. Then we saw that consciousness of the soul is eternal, it is not subject to or rather it is not created by material combinations as some of the other philosophers say, like the Nyayikas and Vaisheshikas. The soul is eternal, and just like the soul, the consciousness of the living entity is also eternal. And for proving it, specific verses were quoted where even in the stage of Shushupti, a living entity by his own experience can understand that he is aware of his condition, although none of his external senses and his subtle senses are active. Neither the gross senses are active, neither mind is active, creating stories from different impressions. So, both of these things, although are not active, but still there is this understanding that one has taken rest very nicely and he is refreshed. So, even in deep sleep, he has his awareness as to what is happening to him, although he is not directly conscious of it. Then we saw that similar to consciousness, knowledge of the Lord, knowledge also inherent to the living entity. So, it is just covered by the modes at this point of time for a conditioned soul, but the knowledge is also eternal. Then the soul does not undergo 6 kinds of transformation. The soul moving from body to body, it moves from one body to another body, but it does not undergo transformations just like the body undergoes. The consciousness may be manifested in different manner, but the soul does not change his eternal position, his eternal nature, or the inherent nature of the soul is not transformed. Then we saw that soul is part and parcel of the Lord, Mamevamshu Jiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana, we discussed that. Then we saw a more elaborate section on the soul's doership, and that he is the enjoyer, he is the doer and he is the enjoyer with respect to Prakriti, because some philosophers also say that Prakriti is actually the doer and the soul is just like a dead stone, but then that is not so. We discussed that. And we discussed that with reference to the 14th verse of 18th chapter from Bhagavad Gita, where this 5 factors of action or 5 factors of work is being explained by the Lord. So all these things come together. And we also saw that the Supreme Lord is the overarching factor for all these 5 aspects to work. So there is the jiva is there as the doer, and then there's body, the senses, and different kinds of endeavor, the other three factors, and all of them are being controlled and managed by the Lord. So that we saw. And yesterday's session we discussed about how the soul's ultimate goal of life can be achieved only by his service to his spiritual master and to Krishna. Yasyadeva parabhaktir yatha devi tatha guru, we discussed that. And we also saw that such devotional service should be preceded by scriptural knowledge. Yeah, so such devotional service should be preceded by scriptural knowledge. So we discussed that as well, and we also saw certain references from Srila Prabhupada, specifically from Chaitanya Charitamrita, chapter 7, text 102. We saw how Vedantic philosophy is actually required. Prabhupada writes one cannot be an Acharya without being an expert in Vedanta philosophy and Vedanta Shruti and Upanishads and so on. So till that point we have discussed yesterday. So today we are going to discuss how liberated souls engage in devotional service to the Lord. So there is also this conception that once the living entity gets liberated, then there is no service to be done. There are two aspects. One is that the living entity gets merged into the Lord, or he realizes he's Brahman. So there is no master, there is no relationship of master or servant. So there is no service involved there. That's one point. Another is at once the living entity gets liberated, then he does not, he himself is independent to enjoy himself. He does not have to serve the Lord. That kind of conception is also there. But the liberated souls also have to engage in devotional service to the Lord, and the Shruti Pramanas are there to substantiate this understanding. So we will continue. So Srila Radha Damodar Goswami writes, he says, even during the stage of liberation, the individual souls worship Lord Hari as declared in the Shruti. Etat Sama Gayan Aste. The liberated soul then goes on singing hymns in praise of the Lord. This is from Taittiriya Upanishad. Then Tad Vishnoho Paramam Padam Sada Pashyanti Surayah. The eternally liberated souls always contemplate Lord Vishnu's supreme abode. In this way, as those who have realized God remain existing in the stage of liberation, his forms, qualities and powers cannot be similar to the moonlight in the wilderness. Okay, so the argument that is being presented here is that one who has realized God, he remains existing even in the stage of liberation, and a statement is made here that his form, qualities and powers cannot be similar to the moonlight in the wilderness. So his form, qualities and powers actually refers to the Supreme Lord. Okay, and this is actually a simile. It is said that in the forest, the moonlight is very beautiful. In the forest, the moonlight is very beautiful because no cities, no buildings, nothing. The air is very good, and then it's very natural environment. There are mountains, there are hills, there are nice trees, and the moonlight, when it shines on such kind of portion, it is very, very nice. Similarly, the Lord's form, qualities and powers are also very, very attractive. But if there is no one in the forest to appreciate that moonlight, then it can be said that the moonlight which is falling on the forest is actually kind of useless. It's waste because nobody is there to appreciate it. So similarly, the Lord has all transcendental qualities which is explained in all scriptures. In Bhagavatam it's there, in Bhagavad Gita, in all these different scriptures, the Lord's qualities have been glorified like anything, specifically Srimad Bhagavatam. But then if there is nobody to appreciate it, then what's the use of Lord having those qualities? So that kind of argument is presented here. So because the Lord's qualities are there, so there must be living entities also who can interact with the Lord, who can have a relationship with the Lord, who can praise the Lord for all his qualities. So therefore, even after liberation, there are living entities who are there to praise the form, qualities and strength and powers of the Lord. Otherwise, the Lord's qualities, which are so much glorified in the Vedic scriptures, will not be of any use, just like the moonlight in wilderness, which nobody is able to appreciate. Correct. So that's the understanding. Thus, since both have mutually opposite qualities, such as all-pervasiveness and atomic dimension, which are eternal and can be understood only through the scriptures. The difference between God and the individual soul is eternally true. And in scriptures also we see that between the Lord and the living entity, mutually opposite qualities are being mentioned, such as the Lord has the quality of all pervasiveness, whereas the living entity has the quality of atomic dimension. But then both of them have been established as eternal and they are understood from the scriptures. So because the scriptures are speaking, especially when we are talking about Vedanta or Vedanta Syamantaka, and generally Vedanta in general, we are talking about the statements of the Upanishads, correct? And Upanishadic statements are meant to take one into transcendence. Upanishads don't speak about karma kanda rituals and activities that each varna should perform according to his ashrama. So those kind of things are not to be found, generally speaking, in Upanishads. So Upanishads are speaking about something which is transcendental, of the transcendental nature. And these Upanishads only, they also speak about these mutually opposite qualities like all pervasiveness of the Supreme Lord and atomic dimension of the living entity, which is understood through scripture. So therefore, because Upanishads themselves are talking like this, the difference between God and the individual soul is to be considered as eternally true. It's not that after liberation they merge together. There is no statement as such. There are some statements like this which apparently indicate that the living entity and the Supreme Lord become one after liberation, but then those have to be understood in proper context. We'll see, Radha Damodar Goswami himself mentions that, and we'll also see some references in that regard. So, this is Srila Prabhupada's purport to Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 8, Chapter 4:13. He writes, when a devotee gets liberation, he becomes free from material contamination and engages as a servant of the Lord. This is what we are discussing. This is explained in Srimad Bhagavatam 2.10.6. Muktir hitvanyatha rupam swarupena vyavasthiti. The word swarupa refers to sarupya mukti, going back home, back to Godhead, and remaining the Lord's eternal associate, having regained a spiritual body exactly resembling that of the Lord with 4 hands, holding the Shankha, Chakra, Gada and Padma. The difference between the mukti of the impersonalist and that of the devotee is that the devotee is immediately appointed an eternal servant of the Lord, whereas the impersonalist, although merging in the effulgence of the Brahma Jyoti, is still insecure. His position is not secure and therefore generally falls again to this material world. Aruhya krichrena param padam tata patanti adho nadata yushmat angrayaha. Although the impersonalist rises to the Brahman effulgence and enters into that effulgence, he has no engagement in the service of the Lord, and therefore he is again attracted to materialistic philanthropic activities. Thus he comes down to open hospitals and educational institutions, feed poor men and perform similar materialistic activities which the impersonalist thinks are more precious than serving the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Anadrita Yushmad Angrayaha. The impersonalists do not think that the service of the Lord is more valuable than serving the poor man or starting a school or hospital. Although they say Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya, Brahman is real and the material world is false, they are nonetheless very eager to serve the false material world and neglect the service of the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, this shows their duplicity in the sense that they say the form of the Lord is Maya, it's made up of material nature. So therefore, once one attains liberation or once one attains the transcendental platform, then he does not have to worship the form of the Lord. Deity worship need not be done. The form of the Lord is Mithya. But then the same impersonalists, they engage in opening schools, in feeding poor men, opening hospitals and so on. So is that not Mithya? That is also Mithya only, right? But then although they are against serving the Supreme Lord, but then they are not against doing all these kinds of philanthropic activities. And we see, almost all, we can say, all the impersonalists currently existing in the present time and place are engaged in such kind of activities. So how is it if they say Brahma Satyam and Jagan Mithya, although they are engaged in all these different kinds of activities, they are very, very vocal about impersonalism, they are very, very vocal that the Lord's form is actually Maya. But then if the Lord's form is Maya, so is the activities, philanthropic activities that you are performing. So that is their duplicity that they are not able to see. So this is from Bhagavad Sandarbha. Srila Jiva Goswami gives, he writes this from text 78, and he quotes from Shankara's Bhashya. Okay, so Shankaracharya in his Sharirika Bhashya, he writes this, which is also written, which is also quoted by Sridhar Swami in his Bhavartha Deepika. So it's Mukta api Leelaya Vigraham Kritva Bhagavantam Bhajante. Liberated persons also take pleasure in making an image of the personality of Godhead and worshipping Him. So just like he said, Narayana Para Avyaktat, and even in Viveka Chudamani we saw in previous session that the first verse itself is actually glorifying Lord Govinda only. And similarly, here also, within his Sharirika Bhashya itself, he has said that liberated persons also take pleasure in making an image of the personality of Godhead and worshipping Him. So here and there he has sprinkled his internal mood, but then because he came specifically to bewilder the Asuric class of men, that happened, but he also reveals his internal mood. Yeah, continuing, Yam sarve deva amananti mumukshavo brahmavadinascha. He whom all the demigods and liberated brahmavadis celebrate. So even those liberated living entities, they also celebrate the Lord. Then from Mahabharata, Krishna mukter ijyate vitamohaihi. Krishna is worshipped by the liberated who are free from delusion. Brahmabhuta prasannatma nashochati na kankshati sama sarveshu bhuteshu mad bhaktim labate param. One who is thus transcendently situated at once realizes the Supreme Brahman and becomes fully joyful. He never laments or desires to have anything. He is equally disposed toward every living entity. In that state, he attains pure devotional service unto me. So this we have heard many times from Srila Prabhupada, that one who has liberated, one who has attained the Brahman platform, after attaining that platform, he actually renders pure devotional service unto the Supreme Lord. So, Sama Sarvesha Bhuteshu Mad Bhaktim Lapate Param. So, although he has attained Brahma Bhuta, the Lord's Bhakti is considered as Param. He writes, Param. Krishna says Param. So, the Mayavadis, the impersonalists, they say Bhakti is just a means to attain Jnana, to attain liberation. But Bhagavad Gita is very clear. Once you attain the Brahma Bhuta platform, once you realize that you are Brahman, then your devotional service actually starts, because the Bhakti, his Bhakti, not any other's Bhakti, not Shiva's Bhakti, not Durga's Bhakti, Mad Bhaktim, then which is Param, which is transcendental, the highest destination. Then Muktaram api bhaktirhi nityananda swarupini. This is from Mahabharata Tatparya Nirnaya. Madhvacharya writes this. Even for those who are liberated, devotional service in its essence is eternal bliss. Then Patale kasyana pritir vimuktasyapi jayate. In Patal Loka, so even in Patal Loka, who, even if he is liberated, does not feel affection for him. Which basically means that one who is in Patal Loka, if he is liberated, although he is liberated and he is there in such a lower planetary system, he also feels affection for the Lord. So it's a rhetorical question. So one who is in Patal Loka, even if he is liberated, who is there, who is liberated but does not feel affection for him? So everybody feels affection for him. Now this is from Vedanta Sutra 4.1.12. So this is directly addressing the topic at hand. So the doubt is this: should a person worship only up to liberation or even after liberation? The opposing argument, Purva Paksha, is one should worship the Lord only up till liberation, since the result of worship is liberation. Worship the Lord and you get liberation. It is your fourth Purushartha. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. You get Moksha, then why do you have to continue after that? So this is Purva Paksha. Siddhanta, Vyasdev writes, Aprayanat tatrapi drishtam. He says one should worship the Lord up till liberation and also after liberation, because that is stated in scriptures. One should worship up till liberation, aprayanat, and after liberation also, tatrapi, even after that. Why? Because it is seen in Shruti. Those texts have been quoted. What is said in those texts is also stated in the following. Sarvadainam upasita yavan mukti muktahyenam upasate. This is from Sauparna Shruti, which is quoted by Madhvacharya in his commentary to Vedanta Sutra. So it goes, one should meditate on him always, even up to the point of liberation. Indeed, even the liberated meditate on him. Someone may object, the liberated person should not worship because there is no injunction to that effect and there is no fruit to be attained. That is true, yet such souls are irresistibly drawn to worship the Lord because he is so beautiful and attractive. The very famous example of Shukdev Goswami is there. He was liberated. He parinishchitopi nairgunyam. He said he's situated already in nairgunya, that which is beyond the three modes of material nature. Parinishchitopi nairgunyam. But Uttama Shloka Leela, as soon as he heard the Leela of the Lord, Uttama Shloka, one who is glorified with choicest of poetry, Uttama Shloka Leela, Grahita Chetaha Rajarishe. So then he is attracted without his will, no, he is not deliberate, but Grahita Chetaha Rajarishe Akyanam Yadititavan. And then he studied Srimad Bhagavatam under the guidance of Srila Vyasadeva. So although Shukdev Goswami was completely detached, fully on the liberated platform, but still he is irresistibly drawn to worship the Lord because he is so beautiful and attractive. So even on the transcendental platform, this particular instance of Shukdev Goswami getting attracted to the Leela of the Lord has multiple understandings that we can relate to. One is that the living entity who is liberated, he becomes attracted, and because even in the transcendental platform there are levels. So one is attaining this Nairgunya platform, the Brahman platform, but beyond that, the Supreme Brahman, he has transcendental qualities also because he has beauty, he has power, he has opulence, and he's so attractive. That is why he's called Krishna. He's so attractive that even in the Brahman level, even the spiritual level, there are different levels. And this is also said, Brahmeti, Paramatmeti, Bhagavan iti Shabdite. So the Bhagavan feature of the Lord is the topmost platform in the spiritual realm. So this particular attraction of Shukdev Goswami to the Leela of the Lord is instructive in the sense that even those living entities, from the perspective of living entities, they are drawn, even if they are at the point of liberation, they are in Brahmabhuta platform, they are also drawn to worship the Lord. And even in the spiritual platform, then there are different levels, and the personality of Godhead is the topmost level because it can attract everybody, every living entity who is liberated. Correct? The force of his beauty, so this is Srila Baldev Vidyabhushan, he continues, the force of his beauty compels adoration. The force of his beauty, so by looking at Krishna, it compels, it pushes one to adore him. Just as a person suffering from biliousness is cured by eating sugar, but then he continues eating sugar even after such cure, not because he has any disease, but because the sugar is sweet. So is the case with the muktas also. So, thus it is demonstrated that the worshipping the Lord is an everlasting act of the souls, both free and bound. Right? So this is the discussion. So this discussion kind of concludes, or whatever it discussed till now, it kind of concludes the positive knowledge that we have to gain about the living entity. Now there are around 9 arguments that Srila Radha Damodar Goswami presents from the impersonalists, which he counters one by one. So there are different, there is Pratibhimbavad, Parichedavad, there is there are other arguments also that Jiva and Brahman is one. So there are so many different types of arguments that the Mayavadis put forth, or the word jugglery that they do with different Upanishadic statements to establish that it is impersonalism, which is to be understood from Upanishads. But Radha Damodar Goswami, he dismantles each one of this argument and then he proves that this is not so, this is not the proper understanding. So I think there are totally around 9 sections, 9 different arguments that the impersonalists put forward. So this is one, after all this discussion, he puts forth the first argument. So we are going to refute that the soul and God are not different, which means we are going to prove that the soul and God are actually different. So he says, someone may argue, what is this new idea you are propounding, that the individual soul is different from God? About the empirical state of existence, we find the following words. We'll discuss what empirical state of existence means after seeing these references. So he quotes, So the Mayavadi quotes, Tvam va aham asmi bhagavo devate, aham vai tvam asi bhagavo devate, Svaparaha Upanishad. O revered God, you are I and I am you, O Lord. What's the difference here? Tadyoham so sau, yo asau, soham. It's from Aitareya Aranyaka. What I am, he is. And what he is, I am. Tat tvam asi, you are that. Right? So different statements are there. Okay, just before we get into other statements, just a side point to understand what empirical state of existence means. So we discussed a little bit about this in previous sessions, but this is commentary by Gopi Paradhana Prabhu in his Tattva Sandarbha, text 39. So he writes, the Mayavadis distinguish three basic levels of reality. The real reality of impersonal Brahman is called Paramarthika. On this level, Brahman is perfect and changeless, but has no qualities, no variety, and no activities. So he is perfect, but he has no qualities, no variety, and no activities. In short, the Mayavadis are saying in effect that Brahman is nothing, because no adjective or no verb is applicable to him. So how can we say that Brahman is existing? But they are saying in effect that Brahman is nothing, although they don't say so directly. They define Brahman in multiple ways, but they do not say Brahman is nothing, but they cut off all attributes to Brahman. So that is Paramarthika. That is, see, this is not eternal classification given in Vedanta. This is Shankaracharya's interpretation. Okay, so he gives these three different levels of reality. These levels of reality he gives to his followers who have to understand the scriptures based on three different perceptions. So not that these three perceptions are eternally true. So what we are saying is the Mayavadi argument here, not the explanation of some Upanishadic statement. So Mayavadi speak like this. So they have divided reality into these three, Paramarthika, Vyavaharika and Pratibhashika, like that. So he says, in short, so we have seen this. The second level of reality is Vyavaharika. God, the Jivas and the physical universe belong to the Vyavaharika reality. Is in a Vyavahar, day-to-day working existence of illusion. The Vyavaharika Upadhis imposed on Brahman have no absolute value and can fulfill their ultimate purpose only by annihilating themselves. Which basically means that Vyavaharika reality is what the living entities experience at this point of time within their surroundings. So we see differences between I as living entity, between you and between others. Then there is this conception of God also. There is conception of this material world. There is differentiation everywhere. There is duality everywhere, right? So this duality is Vyavaharika. It is practical. It is day to day to deal with things in the practical world. So that is one type of reality. This is their definition. So Paramarthika, there is no duality. There is only one entity, Brahman, who has no quality, no quality, no variety, and no activities. But in Vyavaharika, we see there are qualities, we see there are varieties, we see there are lots of activities also. So therefore, that is another level of reality. But this reality has no absolute value. So you can also say a bit agree with that this material nature has no ultimate value. But then we do not take it back to Paramarthika, where are no qualities of Brahman itself. Finally, dreams, hallucinations and misperceptions pertain to the Pratibhashika reality. The reality that exists only for a short time in one person's mind, in contrast to the public and longer lasting reality of the Vyavaharika world. Pratibhashika experience, being illusion within illusion, is false in the strongest sense. So with this understanding, when it is mentioned, the empirical state of existence, it means the Vyavaharika. Okay, the Vyavaharika reality is being mentioned. So, we'll read this argument again. About the empirical state of existence, we find the following words. O revered God, you are I and I am you, O Lord. Now, in Vyavaharika state, we see duality, or rather, with respect to the Mayavadis, they see this duality. So, to remove that duality from Vyavaharika state, one has to elevate himself to Paramarthika state, according to them. So, in Vyavaharika state, for one to make him understand, for the living entity to make him understand that he is actually not different from the Lord, he is in all respects the same Brahman himself. Therefore, in the empirical state of existence, Vyavarika state, these kind of statements come, where it is mentioned, you are I and I am you. So why, we say, when we are saying you and I, that basically means there is duality. So therefore there is duality. This is how we will argue. But they are saying, no, that is Vyavarika state. In Vyavarika state, the state duality will be mentioned because right now we are not liberated. So therefore, we can speak of I, you and so on. But then once we come to the Paramarthika state, then there is nothing. You all become one. And this is explained in the Upanishads also. See, it says, you are I and I am you. It is directly mentioned here. And it's also mentioned what I am, he is, and what he is, I am. That's also mentioned. Then there is Tattvam Asi, you are that. Tattvam Asi, O Shvetaketu, it comes. So you are that Shvetaketu, it mentioned. So therefore, this is how it is to be understood. Then the arguments continue. The non-duality between God and the individual soul also in the stage of liberation is heard from the scriptures. Yatratva asya sarvam atmaivabhut tat kena kam pashyet. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 2.4.14. When everything becomes spirit for the liberated soul, whom would one see and through what? When everything becomes spirit for the liberated soul, there is nothing to see, there is no differentiation at all. This is what he is saying. Since difference is not a reality, one who propounds it is condemned in the Shruti. And he says, Yad eveha tad amutra, yad amutra, tad anva iha. Mrityo samrityam apnoti ya iha naneva pashyati. From Kathopanishad he quotes this. As is the jiva, so is God. As is God, so is the jiva. One who sees both as if they were different simply attains repeated death in this world. Yada he vaisha udaram antaram kurute atatasya bhayam bhavati. When one thinks that there is even a small difference within Brahman, then one becomes fearful. So these are the arguments which the Mayavadis present to prove that actually there is no difference between the living entity and Brahman. They become one. So our response. Even in liberated state, the soul maintains its individuality different from God. Correct? So now, this argument is not sound for the difference between God and the individual soul in the empirical relative state of existence is heard from the scriptures. So he quotes from Shvetashvatara Upanishad and he says, Dvasuparna sayuja sakhaya samanam vriksham parishashvajate tayor anya pippalam swadhyati anashnan anyo abhijakashiti. Two birds are sitting together on the same tree as friends. One of them is eating the sweet fruits of sense enjoyment, while the other one just observes without eating. So even if on the Vyavaharika level, we are saying that there is duality, but ultimately on the Paramarthika level, there is no duality. But here we see in the Vyavaharika level itself, the distinction or differentiation is being made, where it is said that one of them is eating the sweet fruits of sense enjoyment, while the other one just observes without eating. Okay, so how to understand this? Now, if the living entity is bound, if Brahman is bound, okay, then see, there are two things that's mentioned here. There is Jiva, and then there is the Brahman. One, the Jiva is the one who's eating the sweet fruits of sense enjoyment, and the other is observing without eating. He is like the witness. Upadrishta, Anumanta, Bhagavad Gita also mentions. So he is the witness here. So within Brahman itself, how is it that one portion of Brahman is enjoying the fruits of sense enjoyment, while other portion of Brahman is actually overseeing and permitting everything? And if the other portion of the Brahman, one who is observing without eating, one who is not engaged in sense gratification, sense enjoyment, eating the fruits of material enjoyment, if he is liberated, why is this Jiva, who is actually engaged in sense enjoyment, why he is not liberated? Correct? If there is no Khandan, if there is no differentiation between Brahman, and one Brahman is already situated on Brahman platform, how is it that the Upanishads are mentioning about another Brahman who is actually not situated on Brahman platform? So when Brahman does not have any differentiation, it cannot have any differentiation according to you, and it cannot have any qualities according to you, but Upanishads do speak about variations or varieties within Brahman, where one Brahman is observing without eating, is witnessing all the activities of the other Brahman who is actually engaged in sense enjoyment. If one is liberated, then how is it that there is one is liberated, one portion of Brahman is liberated, another portion of Brahman is not liberated? It does not make any sense. So that is why this verse is quoted. He is saying, see, both Brahman, one is here who is enjoying sense gratification, and the other is there who is transcendently situated. So how is it? How will you classify it? How will you define this? How is it possible to explain? So that is the argument that he presents. Then he continues. Their difference in the stage of liberation is also heard in the following words. Yathodakam shuddhe shuddham asiktam tadrik eva bhavati eva muner vijanata atma bhavati Gautama. Just as pure water poured into pure water becomes alike to it, similarly the soul of a wise person who realizes Brahman becomes alike to it, O Gautama. Right? Tadrik eva bhavati, just like it. Not it becomes the same, but just like it. Then Niranjanaha paramam samyam upaiti. The pure soul thus attains transcendental similarity with the Supreme Lord. So the pure soul, one who is Niranjanaha, he attains samyam. Samyam means similarity. This is how it is to be understood. So he attains similarity with the Supreme Lord. Now what does similarity means? We'll discuss going further. Then he writes, difference in the stage of liberation is also stated by Lord Krishna. Idam jnanam apashritya mama sadharmyam agataha. Right? Sadharmyam agataha. Sargepi nopajayante pralayena vyathanticha. By becoming fixed in this knowledge, one can attain to the transcendental nature like my own. Thus established, one is not born at the time of creation or disturbed at the time of dissolution. So what happens is, one who has this transcendental knowledge, by becoming himself fixed, jnanam apashritya, one attains the same nature, sadharmyam. Correct? Krishna does not say it becomes me. He says sadharmyam, the transcendental qualities that I have, he also attains similar qualities. Sadharmyam. We also saw this. Dharma actually means the qualities of the Lord. We may not have specifically discussed about it particularly, but that this dharma, when we are discussing about the concept of Vishesha, we discuss this word dharma. So dharma means qualities or the transcendental nature of the Lord. So mama sadharmyam agataha. So the living entity actually attains the same transcendental nature like my own, is what Krishna is saying here. Thus, in the Shruti statement, Brahmaiva san Brahmapyati, the only meaning that is easily deduced is, being similar to Brahman, one attains Brahman. For the word eva in this sentence is employed in the sense of similarity. Brahmaiva san Brahmapyati. Right? So this eva is here, Brahmaiva. Otherwise, entering into Brahman after becoming Brahman would be contradictory. Right? So, if one has attained the essential substance of one thing, then having that substance entering into another substance actually does not make sense. Okay, so we cannot say that fire is entering into another fire. Both are same substance. This is also fire, this is also fire. But in Upanishads we see that it is mentioned that one who attains the nature of fire, then he attains fire, like that. So it actually suggests duality. There are two things here. So entering into Brahman after becoming Brahman would be contradictory, because one who has already become Brahman, he has already attained Brahman. There is no entering, there is no entering part, that's not there. Right? There is no entering part. You have already become Brahman, so there is no entering it. So Mayavadis also say, sometimes they say that we do not merge. Although you say that we are merging into Brahma Jyoti, this, that and all, actually we don't think, we realize we are Brahman. So we realize we are Brahman, and then that's it. No, that's the transcendental position. But the statements are there in the Upanishads, Brahmaiva san Brahmapyati, that after, similar to becoming Brahman, one attains Brahman. So these words are there in Upanishads. So if you are actually not merging, and if you are actually not going into something, then it becomes contradictory, because you are saying that you are not merging, you are saying you are attaining Brahman, or you realize that you are Brahman, but there are Upanishad statements which actually say that you are attaining Brahman. Brahmaiva san Brahmapya. This eva is in the sentence is employed in the sense of similarity. So you are attaining something after you realize something. So because you are attaining something after realizing something, then that something already existed, which is on the transcendental platform. But then you were not on the transcendental platform. And by performing certain activities, you are attaining the transcendental platform. So that means you are attaining something which is already there. So how is it? How can you say that actually there is no duality? So duality is already there. It's always there. In the text, Yad Eveha Tat Amutra, one who propounds difference between the various manifestations of the Supreme Lord is condemned. So we saw these two references were given by the Mayavadis as an argument. This was present as an argument where it is mentioned Yad Eveha Tat Amutra. Right? So just see that. Yeah. So he said, as is the Jiva, so is God. As is God, so is the Jiva. One who sees both as if they were different simply attains repeated death in this world. This was quoted by the impersonalist. This is the argument. But then the differences that is to be understood in the context of Kathopanishad is actually that there is no difference between the various manifestations of the Supreme Lord. Not that there is no difference between the Jiva and the living and the Supreme Lord. One who propounds difference between the various manifestations of the Supreme Lord, he is condemned. He is condemned in this particular statement according to the context that comes in Kathopanishad. Not that there is no difference between the Jiva and the Supreme Lord. And similarly in the text Yata Hyavesha, which I also quoted before, duplicity towards the Supreme Lord is forbidden. Thus there is no flaw whatsoever. So when such kind of statements are there in the Upanishads, it has to be understood in a proper manner. Just that you don't quote out of context and then try to prove your misconstrued ideas. So this Srila Prabhupada's purport to Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya Leela, where he explains these concepts, is from chapter 6, text 162, and he quotes this verse from the Mundakopanishad, Dva Suparna Sayuja Sakhaya, which means there are two birds in the tree of the body. So we'll see what he writes. The Mundakopanishad completely distinguishes the Lord from the living entities. The living entity is subjected to the reactions of fruitive activity, whereas the Lord simply witnesses such activity and bestows the results. So which very clearly suggests that there is distinction between the Lord and the living entity. According to the living entity's desires, he is wandering from one body to another and from one planet to another under the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Paramatma. However, when the living entity comes to his senses by the mercy of the Lord, he is awarded devotional service. Thus he is saved from the clutches of Maya. At such a time, he can see his eternal friend, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and become free from all lamentation and hankering. This is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, where the Lord says, Brahma Bhuta Prasannatma na shochati na kankshati. One who is thus transcendently situated at once realizes Supreme Brahman and becomes fully joyful. He never laments or desires to have anything. Thus, it is definitely proved that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the master of all potencies and that the living entities are always subjected to these potencies. That is the difference between Maya Dhisha and Maya Vasha. So Maya Vasha are the living entities who come under the Vash, under the control of the Lord, and Maya Dhisha is one who controls the material energy. Now, this statement, if you understand, based on the argument which Radha Damodara Goswami gave, that one portion of the Brahman is transcendently situated and one portion of Brahman is eternally, or one portion of Brahman is subjected to material energy. Even in the Upanishads also, we have seen when we were discussing the topic of Ishvara, that several places the name of the Lord is mentioned. Krishna is mentioned as Gopala, in Gopal Tapani Upanishad is mentioned. And Vishnu's name is also mentioned. In Rama Tapani Upanishad, we saw Lord Ramchandra's name is directly mentioned. His qualities are mentioned. So Upanishads are actually identifying Brahman with these personalities. And these personalities have been glorified with transcendental qualities which are not there present in the full manifestation within the living entities also. So when the Upanishads have such kind of statements where the personality of Godhead is being glorified, where his qualities, his pastimes are being glorified, where the Shaktis of the Lord are being glorified, then which means that Brahman has that position eternally, or the Supreme Personality of God is eternally existing in his own transcendental abode with his own transcendental qualities and performing transcendental pastimes. So that is there. But then there is that portion of Brahman also who is here in this material world, and he is struggling. He is struggling with this material world within the three modes of material nature, and then he has to attain that particular portion. So when such kind of statements are there in the Upanishads, which is talking about various rules and regulations that the living entity has to follow, where injunctions are being mentioned that he is supposed to do this, that and all. And then the glorious position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is also mentioned in the Upanishads. It doesn't make any sense to combine these two and say that the living entity after liberation becomes the same as Brahman, and Brahman does not have any qualities at all. So one point is that when all these personalities are being explained, when the Supreme Lord is explained with all these different qualities and personalities, you cannot say that it's impersonal, because these statements are coming from Upanishads itself. At the same time, Upanishads also mention about the fallibility of the living entity and how he is struggling with this material world and how he has to elevate himself to the Brahmabhuta platform. So he also cannot become the same Brahman, because within Brahman itself there is variety. There is this personality of Godhead who is being glorified. So how is it that one can become the same personality of Godhead, or how is it that one, the living entity struggling with this material world, can become an impersonal Brahman, or become one with Brahman, or attain the same level as Brahman which has no qualities? So both these conceptions are actually ludicrous, as we saw yesterday. Srila Prabhupada mentions that. So these does not actually make sense if we have to see the entire Upanishadic statements in context with respect to or harmonization. We talk about this Samanvaya, right? In his commentary to this sutra, Tattu Samanvayat in Brahma Sutra, Baldev Vidyabhushan says that the scriptures have to be understood. Shastra Yonitva, the Supreme Lord has to be understood through Shastra, but in the Shastra you might find different statements which are there in the Shastra, but then Samanvaya has to be done, Tattu Samanvayat. So these different statements have to be harmonized by seeing them as one complete whole. If we see them atomically or in isolation, then different types of understanding can be gathered to support one's own philosophy. So this is the reason why Vyasadeva wrote Vedanta Sutra. We discussed that in the first few sessions of this Vedanta Syamantaka discussion also. That Vedanta Sutra was basically written to harmonize all the statements of the Upanishads. When we speak about Vedanta, Vedanta means the statements of Upanishad. What is given in the Upanishad, that is Vedanta. But Vedanta Sutra is mentioned, or Vedanta Sutra was compiled by Vyasadeva to harmonize all these different statements and come to a perfect and complete understanding about these five aspects: Ishvara, Jiva, Kala, Karma and Prakriti. So this is what this is how the Upanishadic statements have to be understood. So you will find some statements which seem as if there is no difference between the living entity and the Lord, and then those kind of statements are there to be found in Upanishads. We'll also see statements in the Upanishad where complete differentiation is explained, that there is the Jiva and the Supreme Lord, they can never be one. Such kind of statements also are there. And then there are statements also that Brahman actually has a form. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the transcendental Brahman. So there are statements to that effect also. So if we have to harmonize all these things, then we have to study the Vedanta Sutra, which was compiled by Vyasadeva himself, who wrote the Upanishads. And when we study the Vedanta Sutra in proper manner, then all these statements can be harmonized. But Shankaracharya, when he wrote his commentary, he did not harmonize such statements. What he did was he developed a certain set of rules in which the Vedanta Sutra has to be interpreted, just like this Paramarthika, Vyavaharika, and then Pratibhashika. So he gave different systems to interpret the Vedanta Sutra, and wherever the sutras were very, very clear and he could not interpret it, he said Vyasadeva himself is wrong. So that also he has done. So it's all kind of corruption that he has done to Vedanta Sutra itself, and in the name of harmonizing the entire Vedantic understanding, he has basically corrupted the entire understanding. That is what it is. So we will see, actually in Chaitanya Bhagavat, one of the commentaries by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he actually gives around 19 sutras from Vedanta Sutra which clearly say that there is a difference between the Lord and the living entity. So we will read through that. It's there. I think I have it here. Okay. So this is from Srimad Bhagavatam. So continuing here. This is from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 4, Chapter 28, text 62, and here we'll see Bhagavatam also is speaking in similar language. Aham bhavan na cha anya tvam. So I, aham, and bhavan, you, na cha anya, we are not different. Na anya, we are not different. Tvam eva aham, you, whoever you are, I am also the same. Tvam eva aham vichakshva bho, and this you should understand very clearly. He says, Nano pashyanti kavayash chitram jatu managapi. My dear friend, I, the super soul, and you, the individual soul, are not different. Okay. In the verse, it just says not different, but Srila Prabhupada in his translation writes not different in quality. For we are both spiritual. In fact, my dear friend, you are qualitatively not different from me in your constitutional position. Again, the word qualitative is not there in the verse, but Srila Prabhupada inserts that for giving us the perfect understanding. Just try to consider this subject. Those who are actually advanced scholars, who are in knowledge, do not find any qualitative difference between you and me. In purport, he writes, both the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the living entity are qualitatively one. There is no factual difference between the two. The Mayavadi philosophers are again and again defeated by the illusory energy because they think that there is no separation between the super soul and the individual soul, or that there is no super soul. They are also misled in thinking that everything is the super soul. There are different understandings that these Mayavadis have. However, those who are Kavayaha, learned scholars, actually know the facts. They do not commit such mistakes. They know that God and the individual soul are one in quality, but the individual soul falls under the clutches of Maya. Whereas the super soul, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is the controller of Maya, right? Maya Dhisha and Maya Vasha. Maya is the creation of the Supreme Lord. Maya Srashta. He is also the creator of Maya. Therefore, the Supreme Lord is the controller of Maya. Although one in quality with the Supreme Lord, the individual soul is under the control of Maya. Mayavadi philosophers cannot distinguish between the controller and the controlled. Basically saying that idiots, they cannot even distinguish between the control and the controller. The next verse, Yatha Purusha Atmanam Ekam Adarsha Chakshushoho Dvidha Bhutam Aveksheta Tathaivantaram Avayoho. As a person sees the reflection of his body in a mirror to be one with himself and not different, whereas others actually see two bodies. So in our material condition, in which the living being is affected and yet not affected, there is a difference between the God and living entity. The translation may be a bit difficult, the purports are there. So read the purport. Being affected by the conditioning of matter, Mayavadi philosophers cannot see the difference between the Supreme Lord and the living entity. When the sun is reflected in a pot of water, the sun knows that there is no difference between himself and the reflected sun in the water. Those in ignorance, however, perceive that there are many small suns reflected in each and every pot. Correct. This is a famous Mayavadi example. But Srila Prabhupada writes here, as far as the brilliance is concerned, there is brilliance both in the original sun and in the reflections, but the reflections are small, whereas the original sun is very large. So although qualitatively they are same, but the brilliance that is manifested by the sun is infinite times more than the brilliance that is manifested by the reflections. So that is how the pot example is to be understood. And we will see, actually these arguments are presented by the Mayavadi. So even Radha Damodar Goswami will counter that. We will see this particular example. Srila Prabhupada continues, Vaishnava philosophers conclude that the living entity is simply a small sample of the original Supreme Personality of Godhead. Qualitatively, God and the living entities are one, but quantitatively, the living entities are small fragments of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Lord is full, powerful and opulent. In the previous verse, the Lord says, my dear friend, you and I are not different. We saw that verse, the previous to this one. This non-difference refers to qualitative oneness, for it was not necessary for the Paramatma, the Supreme Personality, to remind the conditioned soul that he is not one in quantity. Okay, so what does it mean? I think I have a footnote here. Yeah. So there is Paramatma who has to remind the other Brahman that there is no difference between them. Correct. Again, the same argument. There is one Brahman who is Paramatma. He has to remind the other Brahman that there is no difference between you and me, which implies that there is definitely difference which Paramatma has not forgotten, but the other Brahman has forgotten. So there are two things. There are two entities here. Correct. So this is the understanding. This is what Prabhupada writes here. That it was not necessary for Paramatma, the Supreme Personality, to remind the conditioned soul that he is not one in quantity. The self-realized soul never thinks that he and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are one in every respect. For the Supreme Personality of Godhead, however, there is no difference between the body and the soul. He is completely soul. He has no material body. Although the Super Soul, Paramatma, and the individual soul are both within the body, the Super Soul is devoid of designation, which means he does not have material body. Whereas the conditioned soul is designated by his particular type of body, which again defeats the Mayavadic proposition. That although Super Soul is there, he is devoid of designation. He does not have material body. So within the heart, it's understood. Dvasaparna, this particular verse from Mundaka Upanishad says there are two entities within the body, where which one is enjoying the fruits of his activities, the other is just witnessing. But the other one who is witnessing, he does not have any material body. He does not have any designations as such. But whereas the one who is eating the fruits of that particular body actually identifies himself with that body and the fruits which the body produces. The Super Soul is called Antaryami and he is extensive. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Kshetragyam chapi mam vidhi sarva kshetreshu bharata. So although in Bhagavad Gita it's Kshetragya is living and is also Kshetragya, but is limited to his body. But then there is another Kshetragya also, who is Mam. Krishna says, this is me. Kshetragyam chapi mam vidhi. You should know, vidhi, you should know, O Arjuna, who knows everything. Sarva kshetreshu bharata. I am spread all over in all the bodies. O scion of Bharat, you should understand that I am also the knower in all bodies. Correct? So therefore, he is different from the Kshetragya. So within 13th chapter of Bhagavad Gita also this comes. Although there are two Kshetragyas, both are addressed as Kshetragya, the living entity as well as the Supreme Lord, but then there is a difference because this Kshetragya, he knows all the Kshetras, he knows all the bodies. Generally, in his conditioned state, the individual soul cannot understand his relationship with the Super Soul, but sometimes when he is free from all conditioned existence, he can see the real difference between the Super Soul and himself. Because in the conditioned state, we cannot understand the difference or the relationship with the Super Soul. But one who is free from all conditioned existence, he can see that there is a real difference between the two. When the Super Soul tells the conditioned soul, you and I are one and the same, it is to remind the conditioned soul of his spiritual identity as being qualitatively one. In third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, it is said, Yathol mukad visphulingad dhumad vapi susambhavad apyatmatvena bhimat matad yathagni prithak ulmukat. Fire has different features. There is flame, the sparks and the smoke. Although these are one in quality, there is still a difference between the fire, the flame, the spark and the smoke. The next verse in Srimad Bhagavatam, it is stated, Atma tatha prithak drashta bhagavan brahma samgitaha. Atma is the individual soul as well as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the seer of everything. Although both are spirit, there is always a difference. In Vishnu Purana also, Prabhupada quotes that fire is situated in one place but it distributes heat and light. Similarly, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is distributing its energies in different ways. The living entity is but one of these energies. It's a marginal energy. Only atheists consider living entity and the personality of Godhead equal in all respects. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu therefore says, Mayavadi bhashya shunile hoy sarvanash. If one follows the instructions of Mayavadi philosophers and believes that the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the individual soul are one, his understanding of real philosophy is forever doomed. In the next verse, it mentions, in this way both swans live together in the heart. When the one swan is instructed by the other, he is situated in his constitutional position. This means he regains his original Krishna consciousness, which was lost because of his material attraction. And the purport, Srila Prabhupada writes that both individual soul and super soul are compared to Hamsa, because they are white or uncontaminated. But once one is superior and the other is inferior, because one gets under the influence of the material nature while the other is always transcendental to material nature. Then he says the Supreme Personality of God Krishna comes down to deliver his devotees and kill the demons, and he also gives his instructions in the form of Bhagavad Gita. The individual soul has to understand his position by the grace of the Lord and the spiritual master, because the text of Bhagavad Gita cannot be understood simply by academic qualification. Right? Although the living entity and the super soul are one in quality, the individual soul has to pursue the instruction of the super soul. That is the state of liberation. Now, he gives further arguments. That non-dual statements in the scriptures are actually consistent with proper understanding. Yeah. So just see this section. So Srila Radha Damodar Goswami writes, this being so, the non-duality between God and the individual souls, which is acknowledged in the text, Tvam va aham asmi, is actually consistent because the latter's sustenance and activities, means the living entity's sustenance and activities, are dependent on God, and because they are pervaded by Him. So because Supreme Lord pervades everything, one can identify himself as the Supreme Lord also, because he is pervaded by the Supreme Personality of God in his Paramatma feature. So that way, when statements of Upanishads speak like this, it is to be understood because Supreme Lord is pervading everywhere, I am also a part of His. Similarly, in the conversation between the senses found in the Chandogya Upanishad, since the functions of speech and the other sense organs are dependent on prana, right? There are different working senses like speech, then hands, legs, like that. So these are working senses, and the other sense organs, they are all dependent on prana, the chief life air. We discussed that before. They are all described as being a form of prana. Navaivacho na chakshushmi na shrotrani na manamshiti achakshate prana iti eva chakshate prana hi evaitani sarvani bhavati. The wise do not refer to the senses as speech, eyes, ears or mind. They call them prana. Prana actually becomes all the senses, because the senses actually cannot work without life air. Right? We discussed that. So because the senses cannot work without life air, so therefore the senses can also be technically called as prana, because they are completely dependent on the pranavayu. So similarly, the living entity also cannot work, or he cannot accomplish whatever he wants to accomplish. He is completely dependent on the Lord. So therefore, the living entity is also classified as Brahman, or the non-difference is being mentioned in multiple places in that sense. In the Vishnu Purana, it is mentioned that an object is a form of that which pervades it. So, yoyam tavagato deva samipam devata ganaha sattam eva jagat srashta yata sarvagato bhavan. O Lord, this host of demigods that has come before you is you yourself, for you are omnipresent, all-pervading, the creator of the universe. So, because the Lord is all-pervading, so therefore, when the demigods are mentioned that they are you yourself, they are the Supreme Lord themselves, it is to be understood properly. If you remember the discussion that we had in the chapter of Ishvara, we saw that when the Lord is all-pervading, each and every aspect of this material nature and each and every aspect of the administrator of the material nature, the potency that they have is actually bestowed upon them by the Supreme Lord Himself. Correct? So every living entity and every material manifestation is just an expansion of His own energy, and He has given His potency to these personalities and to different aspects of material nature. So in that sense, there's actually no difference, because it is the energy of the Supreme Lord Himself, Shakti, Shaktiman, Abheda. We saw that. So because the Supreme Lord is all-pervading, it is all His energies alone. So therefore, those who actually exhibit the potency of the Lord in a superlative manner, they are sometimes classified as the Supreme Lord Himself. Although from philosophical point of view, from Tattva point of view, they are essentially different from the Supreme Lord in the sense that they are Jivas and the Supreme Lord is Vishnu. In the Bhagavad Gita, it is also said, Sarvam samapnoshi tatosi sarvaha. You pervade everything, hence you are everything. As for the text, Yatratva asya sarvam, it states that liberated soul's transcendental body senses and so on are all manifested by the mere will of the Supreme Lord. Otherwise, the word sarva all would be contradictory. This also we saw, yastvasya sarvam was there before. So I think I have reproduced it here. So yeah, yastrastvasya sarvam atmaiva bhut tat kena kam pashyet. Right? When everything becomes spirit for the liberated soul, whom would one see and through what? Correct? This was the quote that we read, no? When everything becomes spirit for the liberated soul, whom would one see and through what? Because whatever he sees is actually spiritual. So there is nothing material that he sees. And because the word sarvam is being used here, right? The word sarvam implies plurality, which is inconsistent in a state of absolute oneness. So when everything, this word sarvam is used, when everything becomes spirit for the liberated soul. So that means the liberated soul is able to see many things, which has attained the nature of spirit, right? Everything becomes spirit. So when this plurality is being mentioned, then how can we say that there is no plurality, there is no duality, there is only singularity, there is only Advaitavad. So which is inconsistent in the state of absolute oneness. Now this might seem very technical, but Vedantic discourses are like this, where each and every word is being then explained, it's dismantled, and then the context had to be put, and then the way each and every word Upanishads are there, then it has to be explained appropriately. So because for a liberated soul, according to Mayavad philosophy, according to Advaitavad philosophy, he does not see anything different from him. But then it's mentioned, sarvam, yatratva asyam, sarvam, everything becomes spirit for the liberated soul. So he's seeing varieties, but then he's seeing qualitative oneness in those varieties. So that is why everything comes. That's why sarvam is being used. So that's what he's explaining. That as for the text, yatra tva asya sarvam, it states the liberated soul's transcendental body, senses and so on are all manifested by the mere will of the Supreme Lord. So in a liberated state, then the living entities have their own transcendental body and senses which are manifested by the will of the Supreme Lord. So therefore there is differentiation. There are different transcendental bodies. Each living entity has a different transcendental body, different transcendental senses, different relationships with the Lord. That is why the word sarva is being used. Otherwise, it will not make any sense, because sarva all would be contradictory to the concept of this impersonalists who say there is no everything, there is only one thing, there is only Brahman. You do not say everything, there is only one thing. Okay, so this is the commentary of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. So I'll just read this fast. Just for the record, because there are so many sutras which actually classify that the living entities are actually different from the Supreme Lord. So this is from Brahma Sutra 1.1.17. It is said, since the blissful Lord is different from the living entities, he cannot be accepted as belonging to the category of living entities. And for each of these sutras, Acharyas, Madhvacharya, Ramanujacharya, then Baldev Vidyabhushan, they give different quotes from the Upanishads and different scriptures to prove each of these statements that this is how the Upanishads have to be understood. Then from 1.1.21, the Supersoul has been assented as different from exalted living entities like the Sun God. Therefore, the Supersoul is certainly different from the living entities. Then this is from 1.1.29. The Lord has established himself as the only worshipable object. The characteristics of the Supersoul are found in the individual soul to a great extent. Yet the Supersoul is the ecstatic and almighty life and soul of the living entity. Now, just before we continue, see, one thing we can see is that this is only one, this one word or two words. Bheda, Yapeda, Shach, Cha. But then the translation goes into multiple words. So how do the Acharyas derive that? How do they expand this particular statement? So this comes from the knowledge of corresponding statements in the Upanishads. So Bheda Yapadesha Cha, when it's mentioned, then based on the context in which this particular sutra comes, there is a flow of the Upanishads from which corresponding statements are being taken. So when we see the commentary of Baldev Vidyabhushan or of any of the Acharyas, when for this particular sutra, when they give such kind of translation or explanation like that, it is understood from the context of the Upanishads and the statement of the Upanishads which are actually contributing to this particular sutra. So sutra itself means it's a very terse, it's very compact, right? But these compact statements and the corresponding synonyms and corresponding words which are mentioned in the Upanishads are being taken together, and a coherent philosophy is then, I'll not say created, but it is then recognized or understood in that way. So that's why we'll see that these translations, which are so big for each of the sutras, they are actually the Siddhanta, the proper philosophical understanding based on the Upanishads, which actually contributed to this particular sutra. So that is how it is to be understood. So next, this from 1 to 8, the distinction between the living entity and the Supreme Lord is that the living entity possesses a material body and is therefore under the control of karma. But even though the Supreme Lord dwells within the bodies of the living entities, he is not under the control of karma. That is why he is not subjected to the feelings of material happiness and distress. So we discussed that. It was right there in the purport to this 4th canto that we discussed. Then from 1 to 11, both the living entity and the Supreme Lord are situated within the core of the living entity's heart. This is well known through the Puranas. So there are two things. There is the living entity and the Supreme Lord. So both are situated. Not that only one thing is there. From 1 to 17, the personality within your eyes is none other than the Supreme Brahman, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The characteristics of Brahman, such as immortality, cannot remain in a reflection in the Sun God or in the ordinary living entities. So this personality within your eyes, this particular statement is taken from Chandogya Upanishad. So Chandogya Upanishad has this long section where this discussion comes as to who is that personality who is reflected in your eyes. So then the discussion goes whether it is Jiva, whether it is Prana, it is Prakriti, who is that? But then finally it is arrived at that it is the Supreme Lord himself who is actually the reflection of the eyes, and he has the quality of immortality which is never hampered. That the immortality of the Lord is never hampered, it is never affected, whereas the others like the demigods, like Sun God, he is not immortal because he acquires material bodies. Ordinary living entities, they acquire material body, so therefore they are not in true sense immortal, but the characteristics of Brahman, which is explained as immortal, is applicable only to the Supreme Lord. So which basically means that there is difference between these two, the Supreme Lord and other living entities. So this is from 1 to 20. Both the living entity and the super soul are present within the body, but the followers of the Kanva and Madhyandina branches of the Veda accept the super soul as different than the individual soul. And this commentary quotes from different branches of these Vedic literatures to prove that point. From 1 to 28. Neither the living entities nor the demigods are fit to be called Vaishvanara or the super soul. Only Lord Vishnu is the super soul. So Vaishvanaro Bhutva Praninam Deha Mashita. That's mentioned, it comes in Bhagavad Gita also. So the Vaishvanara, this concept, this particular word, term is also used at several places in the Upanishads. And Ateva na Devata Bhutam cha. So this particular says about this particular topic. Then from 135, the Supreme Lord is one and the object of knowledge, whereas the living entities are many and the knowers. Thus they are different. Then from 137, one remains in the tree of material existence simply as the witness, while the other enjoys the fruits of that tree in the form of the results of karma. Therefore they are different. We saw this. So 1.3.12, he is unseen and yet he sees everything. Right? From Ishoparishad we have studied this. He is unheard yet he is the object of hearing. Therefore none other than the Supreme Brahman is inexhaustible. So when we read these statements, we can see which kind of quotations our acharyas would have given. This with Dwasuparna quotation would come in this particular statement for this particular sutra. Then this will be from Ishopanishad will be taken, and from others also we see that this comes from Chandogya Upanishad. So the sutras are actually derived from the Upanishadic statement itself, and just by looking at the sutras we can see which Upanishads basically is speaking about and how an harmonization is being arrived at. Yeah, this from 1.3.18. While describing the word Dahara or the super soul, the living entities are also sometimes referred to as Dahara. Therefore, one should not consider the super soul as an ordinary living entity, because the 8 extraordinary qualities attributed to the super soul can never fully manifest in the living entities. So this again another section of Dahara Vidya that comes, I think in Chandogya Upanishad only, if I remember correctly. So where this cave heart, the cave of heart is mentioned with respect to the living entities, and then who resides in the cave of heart. So that discussion comes. So then again, it's elaborated discussion in Chandogya Upanishad, where this arguments are put forth and back, saying the one who resides in the cave of the heart is actually the living entity. The one who resides in the cave of heart is actually the super soul. So this Dahara Vidya is then explained in that manner. And we also saw this actually when we were discussing about Ishvara, I think. Then we saw this particular sutra, 1320, Anyarthas cha Paramarshaha. That when the Upanishads speak about the living entity, I'll read this. The mention of the living entities in relation to the word Dahara or super soul indicates that the living entities are meant to acquire knowledge about the super soul. When a living entity achieves the Supreme Brahman through his service, he can also access these 8 extraordinary qualities. Right? So I think this is there in page 6 where we discussed that there are 8 different qualities which is mentioned to living entity, and this was presented as an argument by the Mayavadis, which Radha Damodar Goswami included here. And he said that, see, this living entity has these 8 different qualities, therefore the living entity and the super soul are one and the same. At that time, we discussed this sutra, that when scriptures are speaking like this, then using the living entities as reference, the qualities of the super soul has to be understood. Okay, it is not that the living entity himself becomes a super soul. The qualities of the living entities, by understanding the qualities of living entities, one can understand the qualities of super soul. Because in the conditioned state, one does not have a logical way to understand the qualities of the Supreme Lord. Right? Super soul's qualities cannot be understood. But by keeping himself as reference, understanding that he is not this body, the body is subjected to transformation, he is not the body, he is a living entity, his soul, the super soul also will have similar qualities. Because I want not to die, I want to exist eternally, then when I achieve a particular state, I will also become eternal. So therefore super soul is always eternal. I always want to become happy. But then in this material world, in material realm, I am not attaining happiness all the time. I am not blissful in nature. So my inherent nature is blissful. Therefore the super soul's inherent nature also will be blissful. I do not want to die, which means death is not there for super soul. So keeping ourselves as reference, we try to come to the qualities of the super soul. So Upanishad statements speak like that also. So this is proved by this particular statement. Anyarthas cha paramarshaha. So when the mention of living entities in relation to the word Dahara or super soul indicates that living entities are meant to acquire knowledge about the super soul, keeping oneself as the reference. So in 1342, both during deep sleep and after giving up the body, the living entity and the Supreme Brahman remain different. So during deep sleep, we saw that he is aware, he is conscious always, but after giving up the body also, the living entity and Supreme Brahman always remain different. It is improper to say that a liberated soul becomes a Supreme Brahman. Moreover, the living entity does not possess the quality of omniscience. Hence, the difference is certain. Right? We saw Kshetragya, 2 Kshetragyas. One Kshetragya is omniscient. Another Kshetragya is not omniscient. He is not aware of what is happening there are arguments which are given that I am feeling hungry, you are feeling hungry. If I eat, you should feel satisfied. No? We both are Brahman. But then that does not happen. Right? So if you are fully realized, you should be satisfied with the other person eating. Why are you eating? Brahma Sutra, then it's 2123. Since the Supreme Lord possesses unlimited potencies, he is superior to living entities. Correct? The scriptures conclude that the Supreme Lord and the living entities are different because the living entities are subject to lamentation and bewilderment, whereas the Supreme Lord is full of opulences. 2320. The living entity is infinitesimal, so he gives up his body because he does not have the Shakti to maintain his body. So he has to give up his body because he is infinitesimal. He wanders to other planets, 14 planetary system, and again returns to this world to enjoy the fruits of his karma. The Lord is infinite and all-pervading, so these things are not applicable to him. So even when he appears, he does not have to give up his body. He does not wander from one planet to another. He comes out of his own will. The constitutional knowledge of the soul is eternal. Right? We saw that. When the material desecrations of a conditioned living entity are vanquished, his original consciousness is revived. So why is it mentioned here as a difference? Because due to material designations, the constitutional knowledge is covered, and there is a process which is to be employed to vanquish the material designations. So then only his original consciousness is revived. But the Brahman who is mentioned in the Upanishads is always in transcendental platform. He is not subjected to material designations. Then from 2.3.29, although the living entity is called the knower, he is full of knowledge because this quality is constitutionally present in him exactly the same way as Lord Vishnu is declared by the Vedas to be omniscient. Yet he is full of eternal knowledge. So again, differentiation is there because the knowledge, the quality of knowledge is present in the living entity in the same way as Lord Vishnu. So comparison is being made. So Lord Vishnu is fully omniscient, but the living entity is also full of knowledge. He is also called knower. And we talked about the capacity of his knowledge in previous classes, so we'll not get into that. But then the quality of being the knower and being full of knowledge is derived from Lord Vishnu, who is declared in the Vedas to be omniscient. And it's 2.3.43. The living entities are parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord. They are not the Supreme Brahman himself. Their relationship with the Lord is that of dependence on the Lord. Correct. So these are 19 statements which Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati gave to establish that there is a difference between the Supreme Lord and the living entity. Okay, so there are further also which we will discuss in the next class. It's a continuation of the same references. So it will be like a good introduction to what, or a good recap to what we had discussed today for the next class. We can start with that and then we'll continue with the other arguments. Okay, so we'll finish here. It's quite late, so I don't think we'll be able to take any questions. So if you have any questions, we can take in the next class. Next class will be Tuesday, next week Tuesday. So we'll stop here. Thank you so much. Srila Damodar Goswami ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.